small changes like this, just the fact that it goes up for a week or two instead of falling can make a big difference.
Is this a bit of a reality check for shippers? These mid-month GRIs, are they going to fall away now? Are shippers going to say to carriers, no, we're not having this?
Nobody knows in this market. This is very dynamic and it moves quickly, and this is a result of negotiations here and there.
Welcome to The Freight Debate, the ultimate destination for supply chain professionals, logistics leaders, and anyone who's ever wondered what really keeps the world moving. And for this episode of The Freight Debate, we welcome back Emily Stausbøll after she's been on holiday and was replaced temporarily by our chief analyst, Peter Sand, who's studying well. But it's nice to have you back, Emily.
Thanks, Phil. You can't get rid of me that easily.
No, I know, and I wouldn't want to. But we might fall out now, because actually the theme of this episode of the Freight Debate. Now, I'm not going to say you got something wrong.
I will.
But let's say there's something that's maybe taken you by surprise a little bit in the industry recently, which is a rarity but notable, so we'll discuss it. But before we get on to Emily's
mistakes, we'll just say it,
mistakes or misinterpretation, or whatever we want to call it, let's have a quick think about things that have been happening in the industry since we last spoke on the Freight Debate. Prominent at the moment, USTR port fees. Our chief analyst, Peter Sand, was in the Wall Street Journal again a couple of days ago talking about this. It's front of mind for a lot of shippers coming in next month, I think. What's your kind of view on this? Another kind of headache for shippers, Emily?
I don't think, as we're seeing it now, that it's going to turn out to be a huge headache for shippers. For carriers, yes. But for shippers, and we've kind of heard from our customers through the year that they've been told when negotiating from their carriers that they wouldn't be charging surcharges. I think we're hearing that publicly. Particularly interesting, right, is the one from Costco, who are clearly the ones most affected, but they have also been out to say, we will uphold capacity and we won't charge. And I think it's clear they can all see kind of the falling market conditions. It's very tough for you as a carrier now to say, I need to pass on this surcharge because it's costing me something, especially if you're Costco or OCL and you're the only one really facing that extra cost. And the fact of the matter is, over the past many years now, we've seen how separated freight rates are from carrier costs. And them coming around saying, actually, we now have some higher costs from this is not going to be well received when they were also charging $8,000, $10,000 without their cost base increasing like that. But definitely something very interesting to watch. And obviously we spent a lot of time trying to track those different carriers and see how it goes and whether they can hold on to it. Especially because, we're starting with one price now. This price will rise gradually over the next coming years. And then maybe we'll see more or less impact. And this could also end up in a deal you make with China on tariffs, that this is included and this passes away and we kind of forget about it again. That's not out of the realm of possibility.
No, this kind of goes back to the last episode of the Freight Debate with Peter Sand, but also the blog that you wrote on surcharges, because we've got the USTR port fees, haven't we? And I know you're saying that carriers, particularly obviously the ones the China operators or Chinese ships that are impacted by the USTR port fees, aren't going to pass on that cost to shippers, but it's about the all-in rate, isn't it? They might say, we're not going to pass on the USTR port fees to you. And then in the next breath, there'll be another another charge that kind of puts the rate back up to where it would be if they had passed on the USTR port fee. So it's kind of a big game. Or am I being overly cynical?
I think you have to take the market conditions into account. And we'll come on to the mistakes I've made and not foreseeing and all the rest of it. But carriers, we check whether they do it through a surcharge or a higher base rate, whatever, they are really struggling to get freight rates up. And if you kind of go to the market and you say, okay, I mean, even if we saw it to slightly less degree with the Red Sea, that carriers suddenly started implementing all these quite high, in many cases, Red Sea surcharges. When if you look at a carrier cost base, of course there was higher fuel costs, but they were also saving a lot of money on not paying the canal transit fees. So there was not that same increase that was passed on. But for a shipper, a carrier has a little bit more credibility when they come and say, listen, you've read about this in the news, it's going to cost us, pay us some more, than just saying, well, we felt like charging you $500 more. There's a slight difference there. But I think if you look at the pressures in the market today, even with saying, actually, we are facing this increased cost, it's not going to be shippers who are willing to just take that and accept it.
Yeah. No, well, that does lead us on nicely, doesn't it, to what you got wrong? Well, but the thing is, I say it jokingly, but there is a reason that we say it in this way. It's because we're going to talk about freight rate spikes and the fact that a spike can happen and actually it's unexpected and it maybe kind of defies the logic of the balance of supply and demand. So yes, I say it kind of jokingly that you kind of didn't necessarily see it coming. But the point is, an expert may not see this. It can take us by surprise, can't it? So shippers shouldn't kind of beat themselves up if they do kind of get caught out by a freight rate spike.
No, and let's just be clear on what we're talking about. We've been saying for months now, ever since kind of July and the rates starting to fall, that the rest of the year looks tough for carriers, and spot rates and long-term rates should be easing. And then we saw 1st of September on the 2 Transpacific trades from the Far East to the US, we saw general rate increases being pushed through successfully at the start of the month. Of course, there's a lot of different indexes covering freight, and we didn't all agree on how big that increase was. But it increased, and it held for the first half of the month. And then when you got these new general rate increases again on the 15th, they held for a few days, and then quite quickly they were being updated and we were getting the lower rates and replacing that. So maybe carriers just got a bit too greedy. We're still higher than we were back in August, but the more rates we're seeing in as they come in, the lower that benchmark is going. So to me, it's a relief that it then goes back to what we were expecting, rather than for it to suddenly start spiraling. But nobody knows in this market. If everybody knew, I wouldn't have a job, and I don't think you would either, Phil. Sorry to say. This is very dynamic and it moves quickly, and this is a result of negotiations here and there, and it can just happen that maybe on this particular service at this stage there was a crunch in capacity and somebody was willing to pay $400-500 more, but then the next week actually they had fine space and they could go back to the lower rate.
Yeah, because just to let everyone know who's watching or listening to this podcast, Emily goes into this in more detail in the latest blog on the Zinetta website, looking at potentially what caused the spike on the Transpacific, and some ways that you can kind of make sense of it, I suppose. So I would recommend people take a read of that, because a lot of the data that we refer to in this podcast is included in that blog by Emily. So let's use this as the subject of our podcast, then, Emily, the spike on the Transpacific, because I suppose if you're a shipper and you see something happen, it's like anything in life, isn't it? Something happens and it's even more unsettling if you just don't know why and you have no credible reason to explain it. So could we go into potentially some of what may have caused this spike on the Transpacific on the 15th, well, the first of the month, and then again, a smaller uptick on the 15th of this month?
Yeah, so there's a few different things. Let's start with tariffs. We haven't mentioned them yet today, or maybe we did with the port fees. So okay.
The tariff klaxon.
So there was this extension of the pause on those highest Chinese tariffs, and I think we said we expected that wasn't going to see a huge boost in cargo, but it might have seen a little bit of an increase, more than carriers perhaps were expecting. Clearly not enough to push that up now that it holds, but maybe a little bit more than expected. Then, timing-wise, seasonally, what right now should be peak season has passed. That's gone. But one thing that's still in place is we still have Golden Week in China, that first 7 days of October, where much of the country shuts down, just like they do with Chinese New Year. It's a much smaller time in length, and it has a lesser impact than Chinese New Year, but it's still important for anybody who really wants to get goods out before then. And that usually marked the end of peak season. with maybe a little bit of front loading ahead of those holidays as well. And that's also a little bit what we're seeing, that you're kind of pushing those volumes forward. And then you have a little bit this adjustment on capacity from carriers who were looking at falling rates and were looking at the Trans-Pacific becoming less profitable than other major trades. And when they see that, they will either move the ships or require shippers to pay more to keep the ships on that. So we saw that a little bit, and maybe they removed just a little bit too much. But there are different things, and all of these things we could see coming. We knew about Golden Week, we knew about the China tariffs, but it all becomes kind of a mix of which one actually, do they all kind of steal the flick switches on, or are they all relatively small? And I think maybe they were a little bit higher than we'd expected, but already now quite obviously not enough to keep the rates up.
Sure. And USTR port fees.
Yes.
Maybe
if they're able to do that.
Yes, but we are seeing some carriers already, aren't we? I think Gemini, they've already been swapping out some China-built ships on services into the US. So
yeah, in that way.
Yeah, and it doesn't necessarily mean swapping out a ship. If it's a like-for-like TEU size ship, doesn't automatically mean a drop in capacity on that trade. But to be fair to carriers, it is still disruption, isn't it? They are having to swap ships on, and as we see, disruption does have that kind of knock-on effect on freight rates, doesn't it? So let's refer to your blog again. We've talked, again, let's be clear, there isn't one reason for a spike, is there? It's always a kind of cocktail of factors that all feed into this and create the spike, some more prominent than others. And you've highlighted a few there. But what you've done in your blog, which is quite nifty, is you've actually, rather than a reason for the spike, you've looked at the relationship between the Trans-Pacific and Far East and North Europe to give some insight on why trades behave in a certain way, and actually, rather than it being a surprise, there are ways of a shipper, if they've got the data and intelligence, to kind of make sense of it, even if they don't necessarily like it.
Yeah, and I think, it's not like we look at two trades and we have, okay, this trade is always 1.7 times more expensive than that trade, and that's, if it's not at that, it's wrong and it's going to come back there. It's not that simple, unfortunately. But you can look at these different trades and you can look at it. I mean, if you position yourself as a carrier and you imagine you have the world map ahead of you and you have 5 ships you have to deploy, you're going to put them where you're making most money. And that's a little bit what we see here, maybe that the US West Coast was falling too far down and became unattractive. And the spread between those two trades, so Far East, the US West Coast, Far East to North Europe, widened up to more than what it kind of historically has been in the long run. And we talk about these spreads in the long run. Of course, in the short term, they can appear, these differences, especially if we kind of took those 3 reasons for why rates increased on the Trans-Pacific. Golden Week also applies to Far East to North Europe, but USTR doesn't, and the tariffs, the port fees, the USTR port fees don't, and the tariffs don't. So one of the 3 is there, but your rates into Europe continued falling. There's a little bit of a timing shift, so rates into the US rose higher over the summer and started falling faster. The European rates stayed higher for a little bit longer, but are now also coming down. But it seems like the Trans-Pacific undershot kind of where the long-term average is going. And that can happen in the short term, and we can talk about months. We can sometimes also talk about quarters. The very clear example of this back during the pandemic was the transatlantic, and we did some calculations where you took the freight rate and you took the transit time and you had an idea kind of revenue by TU on this trade, and then you can compare that directly to understand, okay, which trade can I make most money on, how much money can I make each day on these different ships, and you can see the transatlantic was always 3, 4, maybe even 5 months behind the main trades out of the Far East. That was during the pandemic. That trade hasn't faced those same pressures this year. It's never really seen the same spot rate increases, but it's a pretty interesting and obvious example of this kind of arbitrage between the different trades and how carriers respond to it.
Because in the blog, and people can see this chart, we see the spot rates on the Trans-Pacific and the Far East and North Europe all the way back to, where was it?
December 2023.
2023. And you can see, can't you? There is a pattern there, isn't there? Even though these are two separate front haul trades, you can see the pattern because you see the spread open up and then narrow. You see the spread open up again and then narrow. You see the spread open up and narrow. And it is this kind of, they are, I know they're not
It's a sort of dance.
It is a dance. They can't stay away from each other, can they? They widen and then they close, and it is like a dance. So when we saw that spread increase last month to whatever it was it $800? Something like that? I can't remember what it was.
Yeah, thereabouts.
About thereabouts. So when we see that spread increase between the Trans-Pacific and Far East and North Europe, or even though demand and supply doesn't necessarily suggest that the Trans-Pacific should spike, if you look at the relationship it has with Far East and North Europe, actually, we should have expected the spread to narrow. Now, that spread could narrow in two ways, couldn't it? It could narrow due to Far East to North Europe not falling quite as hard as the Trans-Pacific. Falling harder than Trans-Pacific, or it could have been the Trans-Pacific spike.
And it's kind of been a bit of both here in September. North Europe has continued falling, and then we had an increase on Trans-Pacific. That's not holding, but we had that at the start of this month.
Yeah, but I suppose the point is here that we should have expected. No, should have. I said you should have expected. This is what you got wrong, Emily. We should have.
I could step back and you can keep Peter.
Oh no, it's fine. It's fine. I'm happy in my role. But you know what I mean, though. It shouldn't have come as a surprise just looking at the relationship between those two trades.
No, it maybe happened. The narrowing of the spread maybe came quite quickly, and that is more because there wasn't actually enough to back up the rate increase in the Trans-Pacific. If there had been a bigger push from tariffs and more front-loading volumes, if there had been a bigger impact on capacity from the port fees, then it would have come, but it would have come more gradually. I think the Trans-Pacific was pushed up too high, and that's why we've had very relatively quickly this kind of the spread narrowing again. But on the longer term, that these trades shouldn't be able to vastly outperform each other because carriers will move that. And these trades, I mean, we're talking here about 2 of the top 4 global trades, so they move very quickly. And if you're looking at one, you kind of have an idea of what's happening on the others. But the logic goes for every other trade in the world, because ships can go anywhere. Especially, okay, let's stick maybe to front haul trades, because backhauls are a little bit different. But on every other front haul trade, you can see this kind of what happens in one place will have a butterfly effect out to the rest of the world. And you can't have one trade that outperforms the rest over a longer period of time. It takes time to adjust, because yes, you can move the ships around, but they still have to sail there. It still takes time to fill them up and all the rest of it. But over the longer term, you see this kind of relatively narrow spread between the two if you have a high enough perspective.
And we saw it, didn't we? Far East to South America, East Coast. It was just after the lowering of the tariffs, and the carriers were shifting capacity back onto the Trans-Pacific. We saw a massive spike, didn't we, into South America East Coast, and again, not a trade that's impacted directly by tariffs, not a trade that's impacted by things like USTR, but actually, clearly it is. And you mentioned it just a second ago, Emily, around these are the global trades. It's more important than ever, isn't it, that a shipper, even if they don't ship on Far East to North Europe, for them
you can't get away with not following a little bit what is happening on the top trades that set the sentiment.
Yeah,
that is a mistake that you shouldn't really be making anymore. You could make it fine during the first few months, even for the first few years of the pandemic, because we hadn't seen it so clearly, mostly because we hadn't seen this huge volatility. So we were looking at spreads maybe of $1,000, because that was just, we were at a much lower absolute levels. But after the pandemic, where you had, huge increases on Far East to Europe trades and transatlantic, when really the problem was on the US West Coast, and that just sort of migrated out to the rest of the world. And at this point, I think you kind of need to understand that whichever trade you work on, you're operating in a global industry, and you have to have at least an idea of what's happening on a high level. Yeah,
sure. I mean, it's that much is clear, isn't it? And I don't. it's undeniable now with the volatility of the last few years, isn't it? The intelligence that we've got, it's more, everything is interconnected, and it can be subtle, can't it? It's difficult to actually really pinpoint how a spike in on the Trans-Pacific is linked directly to its relationship with Far East and North Europe, but it's all in the same pot, isn't it? As you say, it's all in the same pot. Carriers are going to move capacity across trades, and if there's one trade that's performing far better than other carriers will want a piece of the action as well, won't they?
In certain instances, we've seen this accelerate from even what we had in the pandemic, to the extent that actually there comes a point when carriers don't even have to move the capacity off. Not all the time, but you have instances where carriers don't have to remove that much capacity from the trade, but they can still say, actually, on this separate trade, I will add capacity here unless you pay me, and move it around. So you can do it even just because everybody understands this is the logic and it'll happen. Whereas previously we were probably looking at a slightly longer time frame where you're actually saying, we actually removed that capacity and then we saw the rates change. And that's a little bit what we saw Far East to South America. I think here, when we're talking about the Trans-Pacific and Far East to North Europe, it's happened much faster, and there's an argument there that actually you didn't need huge amount of capacity to be moved off for shippers to understand that rates were going up, and carriers able to push that on.
Okay, so now we've outlined the surprise or the unexpected nature of the spike on the Trans-Pacific, and we've outlined why maybe we can look at data and intelligence to not necessarily fully explain it, but certainly give some credible insight into what's been driving it. What's next? So we've had the really big spike, I say really big, a significant spike on the 1st of September, didn't we?
In the right context, significant is also wrong. If you look at against if you take the last 6 years, then this is barely a little mark on the end of the graph. But from the past 4 months, it's the first time that we've seen a jump in rates on the Trans-Pacific.
Yeah, that's true. In terms of magnitude, it pales into significance of COVID and Red Sea and such like. But in terms of it being an uptick rather than an expected down to continuing slide, it is, isn't it? It's the from a sentiment point of view. It's significant, isn't it?
Especially because the rates are much lower. So even a couple of $100 here and there, they lead to high percentage increases, and then that kind of sets the alarm bells going. So no, it was definitely a shift from falling rates basically on all the top trades to suddenly what's happened. Is this the end, or is this just what is it, a dead cat bounce?
Yes,
very good.
It is. It is. But and is this a bit of a reality check for shippers, because we, as in not just us, but I think generally there's this expectation that the remainder of 2025 was going to be rates continuing to soften. Maybe this is just a little bit of a don't take anything for granted in ocean container shipping. Yes, you might expect rates to continue to drop, but you still need to be constantly understanding and analysing and monitoring and assessing what's happening, because it's still volatile, isn't it?
And whenever I have a conversation with our customers about our outlook and what we're expecting, the second thing I say is my go-to disclaimer that this is based on what we know, that there is still very little slack in the system. If you look at the idle fleet, we're still under 1%. And I'm sure we can go back to that because that is also puzzling me. But there's very little slack, so it doesn't take much for the rates to go up again. That being said, and at risk of making the same mistake again, I struggle to see, we might get another increase here and there, but I struggle to see that it would be something that can be maintained over the course of several months. It's possible, but I still just think the dynamics out there in the market mean that, yes, you can push it up in the short term here and there, especially with Golden Week and tariffs being delayed and all the rest of it, but it shouldn't be feasible, assuming things stay stable now where they are, that carriers could raise rates much higher on any of those top trades. But I know it's stupid to make the mistake once, to make it twice.
But no, the point, as you say, the point is, the serious point is that we you and people like Peter can provide the absolute best insight and analysis of the industry and provide the absolute best data. But all it takes is Donald Trump to wake up tomorrow morning and decide to do something that no one had expected, or some kind of escalation or downscaling in the conflict in the Middle East, or whatever it is. It can change very, very quickly, can't it? But let's just give a quick idea of how you see things happening now. So as I say, we had that. We went on a tangent here, didn't we? Feels a long time since I said this. We had that significant inverted commas uptick on the 1st of September.
That's where we started. Yeah, I couldn't quite remember where we came from, but
yeah. And then we've had this smaller uptick mid-month. Are these mid-month GRIs? I mean, are they going to fall away now? Are shippers going to say to carriers, "No, we're not having this"?
The mid-month increases definitely, and we've already seen that proof of that in the data. More concerning for carriers is not only is the mid-month GRI going, but these rates are also starting to come in lower than they were or before the September rate increase. So we're going back to kind of end of August levels, and that would be more worrying for carriers. It'll take a little time for all that data to come through, but as it looks now, when we get those full, proper first of month updates, whether or not they can keep rates above where they were in August is going to be interesting to watch.
Yeah, but essentially more normal service resumed in terms of that kind of softening market that we anticipated for the rest of 2025.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which I'd like to finish this episode by getting your thoughts on tender negotiations for shippers and give some guidance on this, because a shipper might be entering tender negotiations for new 12-month contract in 2026. And as we just said, there's this expectation for a softening spot market for the remainder of the year and the kind of inevitable kind of implications of that for the long-term market. But if we get one of these kind of, I don't want to call it an anomaly, but an unexpected spike, just as you're running an RFQ and sitting around the table with a carrier, it can, if a shipper isn't able to explain why this is happening, it puts them at a disadvantage, surely, in that negotiation, because a carrier can use this spike as a bit of a scare tactic, maybe, to put in the negotiation. Is that right?
Absolutely, and that is, I think we are quite a sentiment-driven industry here as well, and small changes like this, just the fact that it goes up for a week or two instead of falling, can make a big difference. I think the key here to remember, and this peak and other things, it's really trying to assess how long-term is this increase. Is this increase here now because we've got Golden Week, because we've got temporary tariffs, and we've got the last kind of Christmas stuff coming in? Or is it that there's been a fundamental change and 10% of the container shipping fleet has suddenly disappeared overnight and it's going to be a struggle for next year? And I mean, we talked about it back when we were doing tender analysis for rates starting on the 1st of January, where we were seeing that even though rates were higher, we were seeing that the longer term contracts were having a drop in rates sort of being built in. And I think it's a while ago now, but I think we were saying that if you signed a contract for 3 months versus signing a contract for 12 months, you could get up to a 50% discount for that longer term rate. And that's also important to bear in mind. Maybe here and now there are some short term factors influencing it, but in the longer term, the fundamentals of the market can be seen. Of course, there can be black swan and other stuff that whether we can see it coming or not, but fundamentally, we don't expect these short-term pressures to be something that should push up your rates in 2026.
That's true, but you've made the assumption that the shipper has visibility of this.
Yeah. But the only people who are hearing this are people who've heard our forecast. Everybody else, if you just have the headlines and you just can see, okay, the rate increases this, that, and the other, then you're going to be in trouble because you're going to be more susceptible to it. If you understand kind of, and yes, we didn't see this coming, but we can understand some of the reasons influencing behind it. But you do need to be up to date, or both on your own trades and on the global trades.
Yeah, I mean, I would absolutely love it if a shipper went into negotiations with a carrier, and the carrier says it's, $2,500 per FEU, and they use this podcast as evidence for why they shouldn't be paying it. Well, Emily Stausbøll and Phil Hennessey said, the rate's going to be softening for the rest of the year.
And then they'll call us when in 6 months' time the whole thing explodes and their cargo's getting rolled because they signed the bottom dollar.
Well, yeah, we should have some kind of disclaimer.
We should have a disclaimer as well, yeah.
We should. But the point I'm trying to make here is that we have made a big assumption here that shippers have visibility of, and not just the rates, capacity. It's this other side of the coin, isn't it? We've talked about the subdued demand and such like, but supply is going to be increasing in 2026 as well, isn't it? It's all part of this jigsaw. So my point is that we're privileged that we have visibility of this data and obviously market intelligence from experts like yourself and Peter. If you haven't, then you're going to be spooked, aren't you? And you're going to be more susceptible to a carrier saying, spot rate spike.
Did you not see that I sent you a rate that was $2,000 higher in the latest spot rate updates? That's now translating to your own people. Then if you don't know, you don't know.
You don't know. You don't know what you don't know, and I don't know a lot. Okay, brilliant. So it's going to be an interesting tender season, isn't it? Budgeting for 2026. It's probably worth just highlighting it at this point. The Zanetta Summit is taking place in a couple of weeks in Barcelona, and in readiness for that summit, we're going to be releasing our Ocean Outlook 2026, which makes you feel a little bit confused even talking about 2026, doesn't it? Doesn't seem 2 minutes since we were talking about 2024 and the escalation in Red Sea and such like. So we'll do a special edition of the Freight Debate on our 2026 outlook, but just a little trailer, Emily, before we wrap up this episode. There's going to be more strife, uncertainty, volatility in 2026. What's your thoughts? Are you enjoying writing it?
Love writing it. No, I think again it's kind of speaking to, we can see the fundamentals in the market, and what gets really tricky with this outlook is we have no idea what's coming for us in 2 months, 3 months, 6 months. So even for us to try and figure out, okay, what is that risk of impacting freight rates? That's tricky enough. And then if you add on that for shippers, not only they have to kind of have an understanding of what the freight rate's doing, they also need to know how much they're shipping to set this budget, and that's like equally difficult these days. So we're doing our best, but I think again, we can look at what we can see, and obviously we have Red Sea, we have tariffs, we have all these things we've talked about for a while, potentially impacting it. But we also just have to bear in mind that there's a lot of other stuff going on, and actually understanding, okay, what is that stuff, and figuring out what it means when it hits is equally important. So it's not the easiest thing to write these days.
No, it's not. But as we've demonstrated in this episode of the Freight Debate, is that no, crystal balls just can't exist. And so it's not possible to kind of say for certain this is definitely going to happen. But what is important, as we showed here, is that actually when something does happen, you have the absolute best opportunity, whether you're talking to your CFO or, or your chief executive who says, what on earth, why are we spending 10 times more on our freight? It's being able to look at the data and the intelligence and say, this is why. And, so as we go let's bring it full circle. When we have an unexpected freight rate spike or another unexpected development, you've credible reasons in the data and intelligence as to why that's happening. Thank you, Emily, again.
Pleasure.
It's been great to have you back on the Freight Debate. We will be doing a special edition of the Freight Debate on our Ocean Outlook 2026. So please look out for that. I hope you enjoyed this episode with Emily. I say please log on to the Zanetta website in our blog section where you can read more on Emily's thoughts and analysis on this topic of the spike on the Trans-Pacific. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for everyone for listening and watching. If you did like it, please hit subscribe and join the debate, and we'll keep moving the industry forward together. Thank you, Emily, and thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
See you next time.